Storytelling. Everybody says you should learn it, but it's super hard. Trust me from me, because I know in podcasting, storytelling is a super hard skill to learn and it takes years to master. But I know a guy who has actually figured out how to do storytelling right with podcasting and in general as well. So let's learn how to do storytelling right from a guy who has grown his podcast from 0 to 100,000 downloads per episode with storytelling. Let's hop into it. So Ben, thanks for coming over. I really appreciate it. I don't know if you feel like a celebrity already, but I'm a huge fan. And for folks who don't know you, who's Ben without How to Take Over the World?
That's a big question, right? How do you define yourself? There's a lot of different things I could say. Professionally, my background was in management consulting and then tech marketing, and started a podcast called How to Take Over the World, a history kind of meets personal development podcast. And I started it just for fun. And people have liked it. And that has been an inroad to the podcasting industry. And so for the last 3 years, that's what I've been doing is I had a startup in the podcasting industry. Now I work with a show that you've heard of called My First Million. And I'm still running my show, How to Take Over the World.
Tell me more about Ben Wilson. How did he discover this podcasting world specifically?
Since I discovered podcasts back in 2000, who knows what, more than a decade ago, I've loved podcasts. Just, I think probably the thing that attracts me to it, the same thing that attracts a lot of people, is just this idea that you can be learning at all times. Like, I'm passive, I'm just doing something mindless or something enjoyable, but at the same time, I am leveling up. So I always loved that about podcasts. And then one day I'm listening to the Tim Ferriss show. You ever listen to Tim Ferriss? And he had just had a run on of 3 or 4 guests that I was just not interested in at all. And I wondered, does he not have anyone interesting left to interview? Now, it turns out he's done plenty of interviews since then that I found interesting, but at the time it was whatever. It was a weird run for me. And so I just thought, man, I don't want to listen to him interview any of these people. And it got me thinking, well, who do I want to hear him interview? Like, who's left for Tim Ferriss to interview that he hasn't already? Because his podcast has been going for years. He'd interviewed so many interesting people already. And I realized that all the people that I wish he could talk to were dead. I wish that he could interview Steve Jobs. I wish that he could interview Napoleon. Like, I wish he could interview the greatest achievers, not just who are alive, but of all time. How did those people do it? And it just kind of occurred to me, well, I could do that. And so I decided I would. I decided I'd try it out. I did my initial research on the first episode and did the artwork, kind of got everything together in like 3 weeks, just kind of binged, went nuts. And then, that was the birth of How to Take Over the World. And then that was my inroad. I got married. I was moving across the country, and I just thought, I'll send this to someone to see if they'd be interested in me doing more of this type of work for them. So I sent it to a company called Mission, and luckily the CEO there listened to it and was like, hey, I love this podcast. I would love if you would come do some production work for us. And so I started working for them, and then went with one of their executives and co-founded our own shop called Caspian.
So was it a full-time gig or a part-time gig?
Just a thing I was doing in my spare time, a thing I was doing for fun. And I was probably doing it for fun for 6-7 months before I sent it to this company and then jumped into doing podcasting full-time.
Okay. And just for me to understand, how did you try to grow this thing before getting to this specific podcasting studio? Like, what did you do to get the word out?
Well, and I should say that even when I went to the podcasting studio, they actually didn't pick up my show. So I was still doing it in my spare time. So I actually haven't been able to spend anything other than like hobby time on How to Take Over the World until my partnership with My First Million, which we could talk more about later. Which has just been the past few months.
Okay.
How did I grow it? Yeah. So first, friends and family. And I think it's important when you start a podcast, if you want to grow, to put out something that you're proud of, that you would feel comfortable telling your friends and family, like, hey, you should actually listen to this. You should actually share it with other people. So it started there, started small, as you might imagine. And then also with that initial totally organic growth, it was being willing to appear on other people's shows. I actually had one radio show I appeared on in Salt Lake City here in the US. Mm-hmm. And that was probably my biggest growth driver I actually had a couple appearances there, but those 2 appearances before the MFM deal were by far the biggest drivers of listenership.
Okay, interesting. So you're saying that the way you grew was going to other radio shows or podcasts where people were already listening and they were interested in listening to your episode then, or podcast as well. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's the fundamental idea of growth, right? Go where the people already are, who are your audience.
Interesting, yeah.
And finding people who have a pre-existing audience who are willing to stand by your podcast and say that it's good is one of the best things you can do.
Yeah. We will get into the product and how did you make it good, but I just want to get into the My First Million inflection point. So what happened there? I mean, Sam, so the story I know, Sam discovered it, but like, did he reach out to you? Like, how what happened there?
Yeah. I was already a listener of My First Million. I was a huge fan of the show.
Okay.
And one day I see in my Twitter notifications, no, I don't even see it in my notifications. I'm scrolling through my feed and I see that Sam tweeted something, and it was something that had been on one of my recent shows. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I wonder if he listens. So then I'm like keeping an eye on him. And then at one point he mentions like, yeah, I'm getting some of this stuff from this amazing podcast I listened to, How to Take Over the World. And then I'm freaking out. I'm like, oh, Sam listens to it. So I start listening to every second of My First Million. I mean, I was already a listener, but then I'm like really combing through it to see if he is going to mention it. And then sure enough, a week or 2 later, he mentions the show. His first mention of the show, downloads start taking off. All these people are reaching out to me. My friends are texting me like, whoa, did you hear that Sam Parr talked about your show on air? Yeah. And then Sam tweeted me, or he DM'd me and said, how are your downloads doing since I mentioned you? And he was really interested to know kind of what his reach was on My First Million and what kind of growth that would transition to. So we talked a lot about growth. Then the conversation continued, and I told him, I actually do production work in podcasting generally, and I have this background in tech and business. And he said, well, let's explore ways that we could work together. And so it progressed from there.
Yeah, it seems like a very sad story just the way you say it, but like it's a very exciting story in your head, I'm pretty sure. And
it's probably the best thing that's happened to me in my career.
Yeah.
Like How to Take Over the World has always been a passion project because it's the thing that I would be doing if I didn't have to work. And I've just always wondered, could I actually make a living doing this? And from that moment that Sam reached out to me, I just kind of sat there stunned and realized, okay, there's a shot. Like I have a chance to make a living doing this. Yeah. And that was an extremely exciting moment. Yeah.
Great. Yeah. It's funny how like Sam takes the whole like credit of downloads. Like, some is mine. Like, I know before that, tell me, Ben, how many downloads you had before me. Like, so it's so much fun to actually listen to him and take some credit, but credit you, like I also discovered it through Sam, and I'm a huge history fan personally. Like if I have to do something, I just would love and go like live in the history rather than live in the future because like the times where people are like, like the Rothschild, I just want to be back there in Frankfurt and see how he used to live, right? And I even like so I live in Germany, and I told my wife, like, did you know about Rothschild? And so they don't call him Rothschild, it's a Rothschilde. That's in German and different. And yeah, he's a pretty powerful family. He used to be in like, so they actually don't give him that big of a credit in Germany. But interestingly, I just want to live in a history. So that's why I loved your podcast. And that's the next point of the whole session is like, what I want to learn is like, how do you go and discover these people? I mean, the obvious answer is autobiographies, which you also say it in the podcast. But like, how do you make sure the story connects really well so you have all the right lessons at every point? So most growth marketers actually, especially a lot of even like people I know, suck at storytelling, and you are amazing at storytelling because you connect all of these things together to make it somebody to very easy. And I want to take this as a key lesson for my podcast is like, how do you do that? Like, how did you make this product so great, even though it was a passion project, right?
So the way that I think about crafting my scripts is I will be reading these biographies and I have light bulb moments, right? Where I kind of realize a thing. And so for one of them was, so Thomas Edison, okay. Early in his career, he discovers inventing, and he gets so passionate about inventing that it's all he's doing. He wakes up in the morning, he starts inventing until he has to go to work. He works the minimum amount that he has to, comes straight home, keeps inventing, doesn't bathe, doesn't shower, barely eats, is eating like nothing, doesn't shave, is like getting haggard. And his family's worried about him because he's so unkempt and he smells bad and he's not eating enough and he's extremely skinny. And at some point he starts selling his possessions in order to, start selling his coats and his clothes in order to buy more raw materials to invent with. And I had this light bulb go off of like, oh, he was like an addict. Like this is someone who sounds just like a drug addict, except instead of doing drugs, he's inventing. And so I had this light bulb moment of like, oh, that's such a cool insight. That changes the way that I look at the world, right? Of like, I need to find whatever it is I'm addicted to. Okay. So I have those moments when I'm reading these biographies, and I just try to then craft the rest of the story to kind of get momentum going into those moments. Like, you can make the story interesting the entire time. I do try and do that. There's the old Ogilvy saying that the job of your first sentence is to get the reader to read the second sentence. Yeah. The job of the second sentence is to get them to read the third sentence. So I try and make the whole thing interesting, but it can't be uniform. It can't be a high level of interest the whole time, right? And so I really think about what are those 2 or 3 moments that the listener is always going to remember, and how do I engineer the whole episode around those big moments?
Got it. So the framework is like, find those key moments that actually would, in your head, will go, wow, this would be so interesting for me to share with people. And then connect the stories in a way that still answers those questions and keep the listener listening to the entire story. Okay. And
I think one of the keys for those moments is ideally you have that light bulb when you realize something, when you make a connection. Okay. So if I make too much of the connection if I just tell it to people, then no connection is made. And they don't have that light bulb moment like I did. So what I tried to do is set up the problem, spend a lot of time setting up the problem so that there's payoff for it. So for example, there's a story of Alexander the Great and this crazy bridge that he built. He was attacking an island. So I have to set it up. I can't just tell him like Alexander the Great didn't know how to attack this island, so he builds this land bridge by dumping dirt, and it's a 6-month construction project. But I actually have to set him up of, okay, so imagine you're attacking this island. What would you do? What are your options? Are you going to besiege it from the sea? Okay, but you have these issues, and just get them to try and start to think about it themselves. So when I say what he decided to do was actually change the physical landscape, and he was the one who's willing to see these things that seem permanent are not permanent, that you actually put that connection in your head of, oh, wow, I realized why that was such an incredible insight. So I try and spend more time setting it up than I do actually explaining the insight.
Okay. Yeah. So I took a podcasting course, and there I learned that podcasting is actually a visual medium. So like if you listen to it, you can actually visualize what's going on. And when you said the island, I already had an imagination in my head, like there's an island, like suddenly boundaries and sea around. So it's a very visual medium, and that is super powerful to make people realize. And so what I'm learning from this is like you actually look at the problem and then try to make it stick. And then the second thing, what you do is you make sure that people are able to visualize and can relate to the whole story themselves. And so they are actually in it, right? Which takes me to the next thing is like you still do the scripting. And especially personally me, I do a lot of scripting as well for like ads or even sometimes podcasts. I don't try to do for podcasts because I feel like I don't become natural at it. And you're so natural at it. Like you bring the script to the next level by using the right time where you have to emphasize, where you don't have to emphasize, and the way you write the script. And that's something, the third point that I want to learn from you is that like, how do you make the script? Like how do you structure it? You just like outline it. Okay, this is the outliner first. You just write the outline just like we do on a blog post, but like, how do you make sure that those points that have to be emphasized on are getting the right share of voice and tone and style?
So I guess my key is, so I do script out every word. I don't just have an outline. I don't just have bullet points. I tried doing that and it really didn't work for me. And I know some people who do podcasts like mine. For example, Dan Carlin of Hardcore History does not script his. He just does bullet points. I'm impressed that he can do that. And I tried it and it just didn't work for me. I have to script out every word. But the funny thing is, once I scripted out every word, I don't read it, if that makes sense. So I usually start off reading it. And then once I get into it a little bit, I start just speaking off what comes into my head, of what I want to say about this. And I change the words a little bit and I just speak in my natural tone. But I kind of need that script because it helps me feel comfortable going off on a tangent, knowing that when I get to the tangent, I can just come back and start reading again. I don't get lost in terms of, oh, what was I talking about? What's the connection? What's my segue to my next talking point? It gives me like a landing pad for when I want to go off on these tangents. So that's how I do it. I do script every word, but then I don't necessarily follow the script exactly.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of content, so it's very hard for me to take some content out. The whole podcast is amazing. Like, I just don't want to take anything out because it's so interesting to me. And I'm pretty sure you have the same problem as well. Every event that Steve Jobs' life had, like, you don't want to miss it out. That's why there was 2 episodes of it, right? How do you make sure that the good content gets out and bad content gets like not bad content that's okay should not be told? You know what I mean?
So one of the things I started doing is producing these end notes episodes. Those have been helpful because, every time I cut out a paragraph, I feel like I'm killing one of my children, right? Like, I wrote this down because I thought it was interesting. And yet I know the whole premise of my podcast is it's not just the stories of these people, but it's how they became successful. If you wanted to know everything about this person's life, you would just listen to a book, right? You would just listen to a biography. If you wanted to spend 15 hours, or like me, if you want to read a couple, 30 hours, then you could do that. There's no reason for my podcast. So I have to keep it focused. So what I do is I keep all that stuff when I cut it out, and then I just put it into an episode at the end of, here's a random stream of consciousness episode of all the little details of their life that I didn't mention in the main 2 episodes. That helps me to do it. And then you just need to know what your content is about and the value that your listeners are getting from it. And like I said, for me, it's just knowing, okay, this might be really good. I might think it's so interesting, but if it's not about what they accomplished and how they accomplished it, I'm going to cut it out because I need to stay laser focused on what I'm about, because frankly, there are people who can do the real just like history of it, every single little detail. They're historians who could do that better than I can. So I'm just not able to compete there. I need to focus on what it is that I do.
Interesting. So this is back to the content again, but like when I think about Steve Jobs, right? And I've listened to his 2 movies. We watched his 2 movies. I hope one day you get to interview Elon Musk as well, if he gets time to meet you in person. But what I'm trying to get here is that Steve Jobs we've watched 2 movies, and in your head must be so hard, like, why I'm doing this, because people must have watched movies about it. And you still mentioned a lot of things, but you were able to discover, like, I would say, discover some content that was not there. Like, for example, for me, I don't think the movie specifically talked about that Apple ad of 1984, right? So from the book 1984. And just from my perspective, like, did you deliberately decide to like put those things to shine things that were not there before? Like, how did you think about it? And while we are at it, I still want to understand is like, when you thought about Steve Jobs, you said, okay, there's already 2 movies already about him. Didn't you think, how can I add value to the listeners now?
No, I didn't think that, because I was so interested in studying Steve Jobs, okay. And so it was, if I still find this interesting, if I still want to dig in more, then I'm sure that other people will as well. That's how I felt about it. And not only that, the funny thing about Steve Jobs is that so many people feel like he was a part of their life because they watched the keynotes, right? He was alive. He died less than 10 years ago. Yeah. Okay. A little more than 10 years ago. And so people have image in their mind, which is a totally different problem from, say, the Rothschilds. Is blank slate. Most people have heard the name Rothschild. They know they're kind of rich people, but they don't really know anything about the Rothschilds. And so I just think that it's almost the thing that was helpful to me about Steve Jobs is there's so much out there. And so many people have the question of, who was this really? Like, was he this jerk who always yelled at people? Was he this incredible artist with this deep soul? Was he this ruthless businessman? Was he like, there's so many different Steve Jobs, so many different ways to look at him. that there's always room to craft a sort of slightly new view.
I think what I'm learning from this entire thing is go what you are passionate about. Like if you are interested, then people are interested as a framework in my mind to double down on it, just to bring it to the listeners. So this was all that. Any tips do you want to give us to as so now I'm getting very tactical is like in terms of script writing, because that's where we struggle a lot. Like how do you think about script writing when you're writing a script, and how do you make sure that like, and especially personally me, like I've always stayed away from script writing. Like I'm always an impromptu guy. So I'm thinking like there are many impromptu guys who are like, okay, how to write a script actually?
I diagram it first. And just the thing I would say is the thing that works for me is just you diagram it, you outline it, you find those big moments, you do tons of build up to those big moments. And then you need to just get from A to B between those moments. Okay. So the thing that I think I did less well early on was I would try to give more information between those moments. So for Napoleon, the temptation is to describe at least a little bit about every single battle. What I've come to realize is, to Alexander again, because I was just recently doing that one, is you want to just go from, okay, so he wins the Battle of Issus, which is this enormous battle, and then you just need to get him to the next battle, which is Gaugamela. So instead of saying every little battle, you just kind of say, then he takes over Turkey and he starts to go down the Syrian coast. And then Darius comes to meet him. And then that's it. I actually just skipped over a dozen battles and like 3 interesting things that happened, but none of them are the next big thing, right? So you just need to figure out what those big moments are and then just cut out all the waste and get from interesting thing to interesting thing.
Interesting. Okay. That's a good framework to have.
And then other just like little tips. I always try and have a hammer line at the end, something that will just kind of like stick with you, right? So in Steve Jobs, he provided his own hammer line because he was such an amazing artist, but it was the last words that he ever said were, oh, wow, oh, wow, oh, wow. And that to me is just such an enduring, like, wow, what was he seeing as he was dying? You know, like, what was he saying, oh, wow, about? And so you just want to leave people wanting more. What was it for the Rothschilds?
Like harmony, and there were 3 ones which he said it like to his
yes, that's sons. Right. It was the house motto, which was like integrity, harmony, and one other thing, diligence, maybe. For Putin, it was not his last words, but his father's last words. The last words that his father said on his deathbed to a nurse were, "My son is like a czar." And I just thought that was so cool. So anyways, I think finishing with that, like, okay, you got these big moments, but then what's the big one that you're really just like going to hit them with at the end? Boom. And then the other thing that I framework is I always just give a couple paragraphs at the beginning to tell people explicitly, why should you care? I can tell you immediately, like, why is the story important? Why do you want to know about it? How's this going to help your life at all?
Got it. Okay. I think this is pretty useful. So now the most tricky question for you, what have you learned from the How to Take Over the World? You have told in your podcast, but my listeners don't listen to it, and which leads to a next 2 questions. Second question, part of it is, do you want to take over the world?
Take over the world means different things to different people, right? And that's the thing about How to Take Over the World is you don't need to have the ambition of a Julius Caesar in order to find it useful, hopefully. And so I do want to take over my little world, my sphere of influence. And so I think it's helpful to people who don't necessarily want to take over the world in a big way. For myself, I'm not one of those people. Like, I would never want to be the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. It doesn't sound attractive to me. It's not a thing I want in my life. So in that way, like, I don't want to be president of the United States. I'd just rather not. So no, I don't want to take over the world in that way. But I do enjoy taking over the world of podcasting and of history and of the little things that I'm doing.
Yeah. So the part of the question was like, what did you learn out of the How to Take Over the World? Like, so for example, what I learned from Thomas Edison had very similar characteristics like Elon Musk, like very similar. Both are inventors, like stories are very similar. It's just very first principles thinking I learned like in there, and like how Thomas was like always tinkering with different stuff and like trying to figure it out. And the fact that people didn't believe the fact that he will be able to do something, and then he was able to get it. For example, space, like Tesla, I think 2-3 days ago, you guys were talking about like a bet on people. Sean was talking about like he bet it on himself, right? And same Edison was doing it as well. Like he bet it on himself and people didn't believe he will be able to get something to the world, and he did it right again. For me, there are a lot of implicit lessons and I keep it to myself. And what I learn is also like what I don't want to be. But you must have learned some concrete things that you want to take over, regardless of you want to take over the world or not. So those are the principles I'm trying to find.
Yes. So there are a number of principles. The first one is actually just the entire premise of the show, which is I think people overcomplicate their life journey for themselves. Okay. So Kobe Bryant is a good example. Okay. Here's a man who was obsessed with becoming the best. And it's very clear to see that he was just a Michael Jordan copycat. I mean, this guy, even small affectations, you can see things in his game that are just, oh, he stole that from Michael. He stole that from Michael. He stole that from Michael. He wasn't the same player, right? He did things that were original to himself, but they were little deviations, slight variations. And so people want to rethink, I need to be this totally original person. No, I think you need to find your hero and then find the 2 or 3 things that are different about you that make you unique. And don't feel that you need to copy your hero in every single way, but they already mapped out 90% of the journey for you. Just do exactly what they did, exactly how they did it, except for those small things that need to be different. And obviously figuring out what needs to be different is a little tricky, it's a little complicated. But that's the first thing, is that all of these people were obsessed with the biographies of the people who came before them. Listen to stuff like How to Take Over the World, but read biographies, find out who your heroes are, and just try and understand their biography and copy them. Yeah, other things that I have learned, there's just so much. So I guess the top thing that comes to mind is the level of obsession. It has to be like an addiction. So don't waste time with too many things that are agonizing, that I hate doing. I just need to focus my energy towards those things that give me more energy, right? Those things that I can get obsessed with. And as I do that, I found more and more success, because at the end of the day, these people weren't forcing themselves to do the things that they did. Like they were like sharks that smelled blood. Like they loved doing what they did. Thomas Edison loved inventing. Mayer Rothschild loved making money. Steve Jobs loved building new products. They loved doing these things that they did.
Got it. Cool, man. That's all from my side.
This is Growth Marketing Story with your host, and he goes by Azashad. Come learn from the mindset of growth marketers. This is Growth Marketing Story with your host.